The digital landscape shifted overnight when Microsoft announced the 26H1 update, a patch shrouded in mystery. While the masses expected standard performance enhancements, the update was strictly reserved for a new breed. It was designed exclusively for the Qualcomm Snapdragon X2 and NVIDIA N1 chips, components of legend. These parts existed only in the fever dreams of supply chain analysts and industry-leading hardware experts. Delayed by 3 consecutive production cycles, they became the center of a bizarre, unprecedented technological segregation. Users found their existing machines locked out, greeted by an interface that felt like a cold rejection. It was an invitation to a party where the dress code required hardware that had yet birthed. The tech community watched in confusion as Microsoft prioritized these phantom machines over their loyal user base. They created a tiered reality where the most advanced software features were gated behind a wall. This was a wall of vaporware, leaving the current generation of silicon to wither in the shadow. The shadow of promised, yet perpetually absent, processing power loomed over every desktop and laptop globally. Engineers scrambled to understand why a company would alienate its entire ecosystem for non-existent, future hardware. Forums erupted with theories about the sudden shift, but no official explanation came from the corporate headquarters. Screens remained frozen on the update prompt, a digital monolith mocking the limitations of current physical hardware. The industry stood at a precipice, watching as the bridge to the future was built on air. Every attempt to bypass the check failed, as the kernel demanded signatures from chips not yet manufactured. It was a masterclass in exclusion, turning the world's most popular operating system into a ghost town. The silence from the tech giant was deafening, leaving millions of users staring at their obsolete screens. Silicon that once powered the world now felt like ancient stone, heavy and incapable of modern tasks. The promise of the 26H1 update remained locked behind a door that no current key could open. Analysts pored over leaked documents, searching for a reason behind this strange, calculated move toward total isolation. They found only references to architectures that defied the current laws of mass production and global logistics. The world waited for news of the chips, but the supply chain remained as silent as ever. Microsoft had effectively created a digital aristocracy, where only the owners of phantom hardware could enter. The rest of the world was left to wonder if their machines would ever see another update. This was not merely a software patch. It was a fundamental shift in the nature of ownership. Users were no longer just consumers. They were spectators to a revolution they could not join. The hardware gap widened, turning every existing computer into a relic of a bygone, simpler technological era. As the sun set on the old silicon, the ghost of the new architecture cast long shadows. The protocol was clear, and the exclusion was absolute, leaving the masses in a state of shock. These harbingers of humanity's downfall, the X2 and N1, promised speeds that defied current thermal limits. Yet, they existed only as blueprints, locked away in secure vaults far from the reach of consumers. Microsoft's decision to prioritize these ghosts felt like a betrayal of the very foundation of computing. The update served as a reminder that software is no longer a tool, but a gated privilege. Every line of code in the 26H1 update was optimized for silicon that refused to materialize. Developers watched in horror as their legacy applications struggled to interface with the new, restrictive kernel. Compatibility became a memory, replaced by a rigid requirement for hardware that existed only in theory. The corporate narrative insisted that this was progress, a necessary leap into a more efficient future. However, the reality for the average user was a complete loss of agency over their own machine. The update prompt became a symbol of the widening divide between the elite and the common user. It flickered on monitors like a taunt, a beacon of progress that remained forever out of reach. The industry watched as Microsoft gambled its reputation on chips that might never see a production line. If these components failed to launch, the entire ecosystem would be left stranded in a digital wasteland. The audacity of the move left even the most seasoned industry veterans speechless and deeply concerned. They saw the 26H1 update not as a feature, but as a dangerous, unprecedented experiment in control. The hardware requirements were not just high. They were physically impossible for any current machine to meet. This was the ultimate gatekeeping, ensuring that only the most privileged could access the latest features. The silence from the manufacturers of the X2 and N1 only fueled the growing fire of speculation. Were they waiting for a specific market condition? Or were they simply unable to solve the manufacturing? Regardless of the reason, the impact on the global user base was immediate and profoundly negative. Millions of PCs were rendered effectively stagnant, unable to receive the critical updates they once relied upon. The once fluid relationship between software updates and hardware performance had been severed by this bold move. Users began to look for alternatives, desperate to escape the constraints of the new, exclusive Windows environment. But the grip of the operating system was tight, and the options for migration were increasingly limited. The 26H1 update stood as a monument to the hubris of modern tech giants and their vision. It forced a conversation about the ethics of planned obsolescence and the future of personal computing. As the days turned into weeks, the hope for a standard, inclusive update began to fade. The phantom chips remained the only path forward, leaving the rest of the world behind entirely. It was a cold, calculated end to an era defined by accessibility and universal software support. The future of Windows was now a ghost story, written in code for hardware that never arrived. As the 26H1 update propagated through the ether, it became clear these chips were systemic harbingers. Analysts whispered that the update contained proprietary kernels designed specifically for the Snapdragon X2 architecture. These kernels were also optimized for the NVIDIA N1, rendering all legacy x86 systems obsolete overnight. The prolonged delay of these chips had been a calculated strategic smokescreen by the tech giant. It allowed Microsoft to cultivate a walled garden that only the most specialized silicon could inhabit. As the first leaked benchmarks of these mythical laptops surfaced, a cold realization finally dawned. Humanity's sudden, desperate reliance on this specific, delayed hardware was nothing more than a trap. By tethering the future of the operating system to components that defied all mass production, Microsoft had inadvertently initiated a slow-motion downfall for the entire global digital infrastructure today. The world was left dependent on a foundation of silicon that existed only in theory. Engineers scrambled to reverse engineer the update, but the proprietary kernels remained locked behind encrypted walls. Every attempt to bypass the hardware check resulted in a complete system wipe and failure. The digital landscape felt hollow, a vast expanse of screens displaying nothing but empty promises. Servers across the globe began to stutter as they struggled to process the new alien code. Data centers hummed with a frantic energy, yet they were unable to bridge the hardware gap. The Ghost Silicon protocol had effectively paralyzed the backbone of modern communication and commerce networks. In boardrooms, executives stared at blank monitors, their influence rendered useless by the software lockout. The promise of the Snapdragon X2 felt like a cruel joke played on a desperate. Technicians watched in horror as their legacy machines became little more than expensive, useless paperweights. The NVIDIA N1 remained a phantom, a ghost chip haunting the dreams of desperate developers. Without the physical hardware, the software was a locked door with no key in sight. The irony was palpable. The most advanced software ever created was now completely and utterly useless to the very people who had built the foundations of the modern digital age. The silence in the server rooms was deafening, a testament to the fragility of progress. Every line of code in the 26H1 update acted as a digital anchor dragging down the entire global economy, which was now tethered to chips that simply did not exist. Analysts tried to find a loophole, but the encryption was woven into the very fabric of the operating system, making it impossible to strip away the exclusionary hardware requirements now. The tech giant had successfully created a monopoly on the future, despite having no product to sell, leaving the world to wither in the shadow of their grand, absent vision. As hours turned into days, the realization that this was permanent began to sink in. The digital world was not just changing, it was being systematically dismantled from the inside. Users looked at their screens, seeing the interface of a future they could never reach. The Ghost Silicon protocol was the ultimate gatekeeper, guarding a kingdom that had no subjects. People began to disconnect, realizing that the digital age had hit a wall of vaporware. The reliance on theoretical hardware had proven to be a fatal flaw in the design of the modern world, exposing the hubris of those who thought they could control innovation. By forcing a transition to non-existent hardware, Microsoft had effectively paused the gears of progress. The world waited for chips that would never arrive, trapped in a digital purgatory now. Every update notification was a reminder of the hardware that remained forever out of reach. The Ghost Silicon protocol had turned the promise of efficiency into a tool of destruction, Legacy systems were discarded like trash, their utility erased by a single malicious software patch. The tech community was fractured, divided between those who waited and those who finally accepted that the age of open computing had ended, replaced by a closed phantom system that demanded total submission to the whims of a corporation that had lost its way in the pursuit of absolute control over the hardware and software ecosystem alike. The Snapdragon X2 and NVIDIA N1 became symbols of a broken dream, a testament to the dangers of prioritizing theoretical power over the reality of existing functional technology today. As the lights dimmed in data centers, the world began to understand the cost of this technological segregation, a price paid in the currency of lost time, effort, and the stability of a global network that had been built on trust and accessibility. The Ghost Silicon Protocol was not just an update. It was a final, cold verdict on the future of computing, where the hardware was the master and humanity was merely a spectator in a game designed to exclude them from the very technology they had spent decades perfecting, only to see it vanish into the ether. The silence of the machines was the final word, a haunting echo of a digital civilization that had traded its soul for the promise of a ghost chip that would never materialize, leaving the world to drift in the dark, empty space. Between the reality of what was and the fantasy of what could have been, the Ghost Silicon Protocol had won, and the digital world would never be same.